There are some men whose deaths feel impossible. Not tragic, not shocking, impossible. Because the world convinces itself that certain people exist outside the normal laws of time, pain, weakness, and mortality itself. Men who move with such force, such electricity, such terrifying certainty that the human mind quietly begins to treat them less like flesh and blood and more like myth. Bruce Lee was one of those men. And for nearly half a century after his death, the world asked the same aching question over and over again. How could someone so alive disappear so suddenly? But perhaps the more haunting question was never how Bruce Lee died. Perhaps the real question was this: what did the people closest to him know that the world did not? Because legends do not vanish alone. They leave witnesses behind. And among all the men who stood beside Bruce Lee during the final years of his life, one name carried a different kind of weight. Chuck Norris, not merely a co-star, not merely a fellow fighter, but a man who trained with him, sweated beside him, bled beside him. A man who looked directly into the storm that was Bruce Lee and survived long enough to speak about it decades later. And when Chuck Norris finally spoke publicly about Bruce Lee near the end of his own life, the words were not loud. They were not dramatic. They were not designed for headlines. That is precisely what made them devastating, because sometimes the saddest truths arrive quietly, like a confession spoken too late, like grief that never fully healed, like the unbearable realization that even the strongest men in the world are powerless against time. And what Chuck Norris admitted about Bruce Lee would leave millions of people staring into silence, not because it revealed scandal, not because it exposed conspiracy, but because it revealed something infinitely more painful. The deep loneliness that often hides inside greatness, the crushing cost of becoming larger than life, and the heartbreaking truth that Bruce Lee may have carried far more suffering than the world ever realized. To understand why Chuck Norris's final words hit people so hard, you first have to understand what Bruce Lee truly was during the final years of his life. Not the movie poster, not the yellow tracksuit, not the flying kicks frozen forever in cinematic history. The man, the exhausted, driven, impossibly intense human being underneath the legend. By the early 1970s, Bruce Lee had become something the entertainment world had never seen before. A Chinese martial artist who was not playing a side character, not comic relief, not a servant, not a stereotype. Bruce Lee was the storm at the center of the screen, and Hollywood had absolutely no idea what to do with him. He moved differently, spoke differently, thought differently. Everything about him radiated pressure. Directors feared him. Studios underestimated him. Actors struggled to keep up with him physically, and audiences became hypnotized by him almost instantly. He wasn't acting martial arts. He was martial arts. Every movement felt real because it was real. Every strike looked dangerous because it was dangerous. Even trained fighters who worked with him admitted something terrifying about Bruce Lee. His speed didn't look human. Cameramen on film sets were reportedly forced to adjust recording methods because normal frame rates could not properly capture his movements. That detail alone helped build the mythology surrounding him. But mythology is dangerous, because the bigger the legend becomes, the more isolated the human being inside it often grows. And that isolation followed Bruce Lee everywhere. He carried it from Hong Kong to America, from movie sets to private gyms, from television studios to hotel rooms late at night, when the cameras finally stopped rolling. People saw confidence, but those closest to him sometimes saw something else entirely. Pressure, relentless, suffocating pressure. Bruce Lee trained obsessively, not casually, not recreationally, obsessively. He pushed his body beyond normal limits almost daily. Strength training, cardio, flexibility work, combat drills, heavy bag routines, weightlifting. Endless repetitions repeated long after ordinary athletes would have stopped. Because Bruce Lee feared something deeply. Not failure. Average men fear failure. Bruce Lee feared limitation. The idea that his body might someday betray the vision inside his mind terrified him. So he fought his own physical boundaries constantly, as though he were racing against something invisible. And during this period of his life, one man saw that intensity up close more than most people realize: Chuck Norris. Their friendship began in the late 1960s during the American karate tournament circuit. At the time, Chuck Norris was already becoming one of the most respected martial artists in the United States. Disciplined, powerful, technically brilliant, a champion fighter with immense credibility in the martial arts world. Then he met Bruce Lee, and according to Norris himself, it changed everything. Bruce Lee did not fight like anyone else. He didn't even think like anyone else. Most fighters relied on systems. Bruce Lee relied on adaptation, movement, timing, flow, interception. He believed rigid styles created rigid minds, and rigid minds broke under pressure. That philosophy fascinated Chuck Norris. The two men quickly developed mutual respect, then friendship, then something closer to brotherhood. They trained together constantly, sparred for hours, tested each other physically, challenged each other intellectually, and eventually, their chemistry became legendary when they appeared together in Way of the Dragon. The Coliseum fight between Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris remains one of the most iconic martial arts scenes ever filmed. But what audiences saw on screen was only part of the story, because behind the scenes, Chuck Norris witnessed something the public rarely saw. Bruce Lee's body was beginning to suffer, not visibly at first, not dramatically, but gradually, quietly, painfully. Bruce Lee rarely complained openly. Men like him almost never do. Instead, they continue performing strength while silently absorbing damage. And the damage inside Bruce Lee was becoming severe. Years earlier, he had suffered a devastating back injury during training. The injury caused chronic pain that followed him for the rest of his life. Some doctors reportedly believed he might never fully recover. Bruce Lee refused to accept that. Of course he did. Refusing limits was practically his religion. So he trained through the pain, worked through the pain, filmed through the pain, smiled through the pain, and according to people close to him, medicated through the pain as well. That detail matters, because decades later, when Chuck Norris finally reflected publicly on Bruce Lee's final years, his words carried the emotional weight of someone remembering not just a superstar, but a suffering friend. A friend the world never truly understood. There is something deeply tragic about watching powerful men slowly destroy themselves, while the public applauds them for being unstoppable. The crowd sees greatness, the body feels collapse. Bruce Lee was becoming globally famous during the exact same period his physical condition was becoming increasingly dangerous. And almost nobody recognized the contradiction in time, because success hides suffering beautifully, especially in men trained never to appear weak. Chuck Norris later described Bruce Lee not as invincible, but as driven beyond reason. That distinction changes everything. Driven men do not stop when tired, they stop when broken, and sometimes not even then. Bruce Lee's schedule during the early 1970s became brutal. Movie production, interviews, business meetings, travel, writing, fight choreography, studio pressure, financial pressure, cultural pressure. The expectations surrounding him became enormous because he was no longer representing merely himself. He was representing Asian masculinity on a global stage during an era when Hollywood barely allowed Asian actors dignity, let alone dominance. Bruce Lee carried all of that personally. Every performance mattered, every interview mattered, every film mattered. Failure was not an option inside his mind. And slowly, according to those closest to him, the stress began consuming him physically. Weight loss, exhaustion, pain, headaches, physical deterioration hidden beneath extraordinary discipline. The public still saw a god. But some of his closest friends began seeing a man pushing himself toward a dangerous edge. And no memory haunted Chuck Norris more than the final period before Bruce Lee's death, because hindsight transforms ordinary moments into unbearable ones. Conversations suddenly become clues, warnings become regrets, and silence becomes torture. Years later, Chuck Norris admitted something heartbreaking. He wished he had understood how much Bruce Lee was truly carrying. Not professionally, personally, emotionally, physically. Because Bruce Lee had become trapped inside the very legend he created. The world demanded perfection from him constantly, and Bruce Lee kept delivering it, until his body finally could not anymore. Then came July 20th, 1973, the day the impossible happened. Bruce Lee collapsed in Hong Kong at the age of just 32. The news detonated across the world like a bomb. People genuinely could not process it. Bruce Lee, dead? It sounded absurd, like hearing that fire itself had drowned. Official reports pointed toward cerebral edema, swelling of the brain. But confusion spread almost instantly. Questions multiplied. Rumors exploded. Conspiracies emerged. The public searched desperately for an explanation large enough to match the size of the loss. Because ordinary death did not feel sufficient for someone like Bruce Lee. And through all of it, Chuck Norris grieved quietly. Not publicly at first. Privately, deeply, like a man losing someone irreplaceable. Because behind all the mythology, Chuck Norris had not lost a legend. He had lost his friend. And decades later, when he finally reflected on Bruce Lee with the honesty of age, experience, and accumulated grief, his words would reveal something far sadder than mystery. He believed Bruce Lee destroyed himself, trying to become everything the world demanded from him. And that realization would break hearts everywhere. Because suddenly the myth changed. Bruce Lee was no longer merely the invincible warrior frozen forever in cinematic perfection. He became something infinitely more human. A brilliant man carrying impossible weight, a fighter battling enemies nobody could see, and a lonely soul who may never have truly understood how loved he already was. That was the tragedy Chuck Norris could never forget, and it was only the beginning. Chuck Norris never spoke about Bruce Lee like a man describing an ordinary colleague. There was always something different in his voice, a pause, a softness, a weight behind the words. Because some friendships are not built through polite conversation. They are built through impact, through sweat, through bruises, through the kind of training sessions where two men discover exactly who they are, when their bodies are tired, their lungs are burning, and their pride has nowhere left to hide. That was the bond between Chuck Norris and Bruce Lee. They were not the same kind of fighter. Chuck Norris came from structure, discipline, tournament rules, karate tradition, a world where technique had names, ranks had meaning, and victory could be measured by points, trophies, and titles. Bruce Lee came from something far more restless. He did not want to preserve tradition. He wanted to break it open. He did not ask, "What style is this?" he asked. "Does it work?" If it worked, he kept it. If it didn't, he threw it away without apology. That was what made him dangerous. Not just his speed, not just his power, not just the terrifying snap of his strikes. It was the way his mind refused to kneel before anything simply because others had accepted it. And Chuck Norris saw that immediately. He saw a man who was not interested in being the best inside an existing system. Bruce Lee wanted to question the system itself. That kind of mind is rare, and rare minds are often lonely. At first, the world saw Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris as opposites, East and West, Kung Fu and Karate, explosive speed and disciplined strength, the smaller man and the larger champion. But behind the cameras, behind the public imagination, behind the legendary Coliseum fight that would burn itself into martial arts history, there was something much deeper. Respect. The kind of respect only fighters understand, because a real fighter can feel truth immediately. Not in words, not in reputation, but in movement. And when Chuck Norris moved with Bruce Lee, he felt something almost impossible. Bruce was not simply fast. He was present before the movement began. He seemed to read intention before the body revealed it, a shoulder twitch, a shift in balance, a breath held half a second too long. Bruce saw it, and by the time most fighters realized they had made a decision, Bruce Lee was already inside that decision, cutting through it like lightning through dry wood. Chuck Norris admired that. But admiration slowly became concern, because the closer he came to Bruce, the more he understood that the same force that made Bruce extraordinary also made him vulnerable. Bruce Lee could not relax inside his own greatness. He could not simply be talented. He had to sharpen talent into a weapon every single day. He could not simply be respected. He had to prove, again and again, that respect was not a gift, but something he could take from a world determined to underestimate him. And that burden was exhausting. The public saw Bruce Lee smiling, kicking, teaching, destroying opponents on screen with effortless grace. But Chuck saw the hours before the smile, the discipline behind the grace, the pain beneath the precision. He saw Bruce stretch through stiffness, train the soreness, push through exhaustion. He saw the way Bruce studied his body like both an artist and a scientist. Every muscle had purpose, every movement had meaning, every wasted motion was an insult to his philosophy. But no machine can run forever at full speed, not even one built like Bruce Lee. And as Bruce's fame expanded, so did the demands on his body. The world wanted more. More films, more fights, more appearances, more proof, always more. And Bruce gave more, because deep down, he had spent his entire life fighting against dismissal. Too Chinese for America, too Western for Hong Kong, too small for skeptics, too different for Hollywood, too intense for people who preferred artists to be obedient. Bruce Lee did not merely want success, he wanted vindication. And vindication is a dangerous hunger because it can never be fully fed. There is always another critic, another studio executive, another fighter whispering that the legend is exaggerated, another audience waiting to be convinced. So Bruce kept going. Even when his body asked him to stop, even when pain followed him like a shadow, even when rest became the one opponent he could not defeat. Chuck Norris understood physical pain. He understood discipline. He understood what it meant to push past comfort. But what he saw in Bruce Lee was something beyond normal discipline. It was almost spiritual, almost frightening, Bruce lived as if his time was limited long before anyone knew how limited it truly was. He moved like a man racing destiny itself, and in hindsight that detail became almost unbearable, because after someone dies young, every memory turns prophetic, every joke sounds like a farewell, every tired look becomes a warning, every conversation you didn't take seriously becomes something you replay for the rest of your life. Chuck Norris carried those memories, and when he later spoke about Bruce, he did not speak with the easy confidence of someone telling a heroic story. He spoke like a man still trying to understand how someone so alive could be gone. That is the part people often miss. The grief did not end when the funeral ended. For those who loved Bruce Lee, grief simply changed shape. At first it was shock, then confusion, then anger, then decades of questions. Questions about medicine, questions about pressure, questions about fame, questions about whether anyone could have helped him. And behind all those questions sat the most painful one of all. Could Bruce Lee have been saved from himself? Because there are people in this world who would survive any enemy except their own refusal to slow down. Bruce Lee was one of them. The same willpower that lifted him above every barrier may have also made him incapable of hearing the quiet warnings of his own body. He believed in adaptation. He believed in becoming water. But even water must rest somewhere. Even water must gather. Even water cannot remain a storm forever, and Bruce had become a storm. A beautiful storm, a disciplined storm, a storm the world adored, but a storm nonetheless. During the filming and preparation around his final projects, people noticed that Bruce's physical condition was changing. He was still electric, still brilliant, still capable of movements that seemed to belong to another category of human being. But there were signs: weight dropping, energy fluctuating, headaches, moments of weakness. Moments that did not fit the public image of the indestructible dragon. And because Bruce was Bruce, many of those signs were hidden, not necessarily through deception, but through pride, through professionalism, through the brutal habit many men develop when they believe weakness will cost them everything. He had spent too long fighting stereotypes to appear fragile, too long fighting Hollywood to appear replaceable, too long fighting doubters to admit that his body was not infinite. So he kept moving, and the world kept cheering. That is the cruelty of fame. Sometimes the applause is loudest when the person receiving it is closest to collapse. Chuck Norris would later look back on Bruce's life with a kind of wounded admiration. He admired the fire, but he also understood the price of it, and the price was devastating. Because Bruce Lee did not simply train like a fighter. He lived like every day was a test before a hostile universe. And perhaps, in many ways, it was. Hollywood was not waiting with open arms. The martial arts world was not always kind to innovation. Traditionalists criticized him. Executives doubted him. Racism followed him. Expectations crushed him. And still he forced doors open with nothing but skill, charisma, philosophy, and impossible will. That achievement should have allowed him peace, but peace never came. Success did not calm him. It intensified him. The closer he came to global recognition, the harder he pushed. As if he could sense that the world was finally turning toward him, and he had only one chance to make them see everything. Everything he believed, everything he had built, everything he knew martial arts could become. And then, just as that world was about to fully open, he was gone. For Chuck Norris, that loss was personal in a way the public could never fully understand. Fans lost an icon, cinema lost a revolutionary, martial arts lost a genius. But Chuck lost the man who had challenged him, inspired him, and stood across from him in one of the most unforgettable fight scenes ever filmed. He lost the friend behind the legend, the man who laughed between takes, the man who explained philosophy with burning eyes, the man who could turn a training room into a laboratory of human potential, the man who seemed impossible to defeat until life itself defeated him. And that was what made Chuck Norris's later reflections so heartbreaking. He did not reduce Bruce Lee to mystery. He did not speak about him like a puzzle to be solved. He spoke about him like a wound that never fully closed. Because the truth was not merely that Bruce died young. The truth was that Bruce died right before the world was finally ready to understand him. That is a special kind of tragedy. To fight your whole life for a door to open, and then vanish just as it begins to swing wide. Enter, the dragon was about to make Bruce Lee immortal. But immortality arrived without him. His face traveled the world. His movements inspired millions. His philosophy entered cultures, gyms, films, books, and minds across generations. But the man himself never got to sit quietly and watch what he had done. He never got to grow older, never got to see how deeply he changed martial arts, never got to see his children become adults. never got to experience the peace that sometimes comes after victory. The world received the legend. Bruce Lee never received the rest. And Chuck Norris understood that better than most. Because fighters know the difference between victory and peace. Victory is external, peace is internal. Bruce Lee achieved victory, but whether he ever truly found peace remains one of the saddest questions in his story. And perhaps that is why Chuck's final words about him carried such emotional force. Because they were not only about death, they were about recognition. A friend finally saying what the world had missed. That Bruce Lee was not a machine, not a superhero. Not an untouchable god of speed and power. He was a man, a brilliant, wounded, driven man, a man who gave everything, maybe too much. And when Chuck Norris remembered him, he remembered not only the legend who changed cinema forever, but the human being who paid for that legend with his body, his privacy, his peace, and eventually, perhaps, his life. That is why the story still hurts. Not because Bruce Lee died. Everyone dies. It hurts because he burned so brightly that people forgot fire consumes what feeds it. And Bruce Lee fed that fire with everything he had, his strength, his mind, his pain, his youth, his future, his very self. Chuck Norris saw that fire up close. He admired it, he respected it, he loved the man inside it. But by the end, he also understood something the world was not ready to hear. The dragon did not fall because he was weak. He fell because he had been strong for too long. There are funerals that feel private, and then there are funerals that feel like the world itself has been wounded. Bruce Lee's funeral did not feel like the burial of an actor. It felt like the collapse of possibility, like the sudden extinguishing of a force people had barely begun to understand. By the time the news spread across Hong Kong, America, and beyond, disbelief had already turned into something heavier. Grief mixed with confusion, confusion mixed with obsession, and obsession mixed with anger. Because the death of Bruce Lee did not make emotional sense to people. How could a man who moved like lightning, who trained harder than professional athletes, who seemed physically untouchable, be dead at 32? The human mind rejects contradictions that large, so the world began searching desperately for explanations powerful enough to match the size of the loss. Some blamed medication, some blamed exhaustion, others whispered about organized crime. Some believed the official story immediately, others never believed it for a single second. And through all of that noise, through all the headlines and rumors and theories spreading like wildfire across continents, there were a few people grieving in complete silence. Chuck Norris was one of them. Because when someone close to you dies suddenly, the world becomes unbearable in strange ways. Ordinary sounds feel distant. Crowds feel unreal. Conversations become exhausting. You replay memories endlessly, searching for hidden warnings that only exist after tragedy. And somewhere inside all of it sits the impossible truth. You will never speak to them again. Chuck Norris traveled to Bruce Lee's funeral carrying that truth like a weight on his chest. The funeral itself became historic. Thousands mourned. Fans cried openly. Journalists surrounded every movement. Bruce Lee's coffin was carried through waves of heartbreak that stretched far beyond martial arts or cinema. This was not merely celebrity grief. This felt cultural, spiritual. Like people instinctively understood that something larger than entertainment had disappeared. Because Bruce Lee had represented possibility itself. He represented transformation. A Chinese man becoming the biggest martial arts star on earth during an era when Hollywood barely acknowledged Asian humanity. A philosopher trapped inside a fighter's body. A teacher disguised as an action star. A man who somehow managed to look both intensely dangerous and deeply thoughtful at the same time. People saw themselves inside Bruce Lee, especially those who had spent their lives underestimated, bullied, excluded, dismissed. Bruce Lee moved like revenge against limitation itself, and now he was lying inside a coffin. Still, silent, gone forever. For Chuck Norris, the experience became emotionally overwhelming. Years later, he admitted something haunting about Bruce Lee's funeral. He could not fully accept that Bruce was dead. Part of him expected Bruce to suddenly stand up, smile, laugh, say the whole thing had been exaggerated somehow. Because Bruce Lee had always felt larger than ordinary reality. Men like him are not supposed to disappear quietly. They are supposed to grow old into legend. But Bruce never got old. That detail haunted Chuck Norris deeply. Because age changes how men understand loss. When you are young, death feels distant, abstract, like something that happens to other people. But as years pass and more faces disappear from your life, you begin understanding something terrifying. The people you love are temporary, even the extraordinary ones. especially the extraordinary ones. Chuck Norris carried that realization for decades, and every time he spoke about Bruce Lee afterward, there was a sadness beneath the admiration. Not theatrical sadness, not dramatic sadness, real sadness, the kind that never fully leaves. Because Bruce Lee's death created unfinished emotions everywhere around him. Unfinished conversations, unfinished plans, unfinished dreams. Even Enter the Dragon, the film destined to make him immortal worldwide, became painful to watch for many people who knew him personally. Because the movie radiates life. Bruce Lee explodes off the screen with confidence, humor, charisma, power, and impossible energy. There is nothing fragile about him in that film. Nothing sickly, nothing fading. He looks unstoppable. And that is exactly what makes it heartbreaking. Because audiences now watch the movie knowing what Bruce himself never got to know. That the film would make him eternal. The success he fought for his entire life was finally arriving. Global fame, universal respect, cultural impact beyond anything martial arts cinema had ever achieved. And Bruce Lee never got to witness any of it. He died just before the world fully opened for him. That tragedy stayed with Chuck Norris forever, because he understood what Bruce had sacrificed to reach that moment. The training, the injuries, the pressure, the loneliness, the constant need to prove himself in industries and environments that resisted him. Bruce Lee did not stumble accidentally into greatness. He clawed his way there through force of will. And just when victory arrived, life took him away. That kind of ending leaves scars on everyone connected to it, especially friends, especially men who understand the brutality of discipline. Chuck Norris later reflected on how intensely Bruce pushed himself physically. And the older Chuck became, the more painful those memories seemed to feel, because aging gives men perspective they do not possess in youth. Things that once looked admirable can later look tragic. Endless work becomes visible self-destruction. Obsessive discipline begins resembling punishment, and the refusal to rest starts feeling less like strength and more like fear. Bruce Lee feared stopping, not because he was lazy, not because he lacked confidence, but because somewhere deep inside him lived the belief that he could not afford weakness, not physically, not emotionally, not publicly. He had fought too hard to become visible, too hard to become respected, too hard to become undeniable, so he kept pushing, even when his body screamed for recovery. Chuck Norris eventually came to believe that Bruce carried invisible burdens the public never understood. Not only physical pain, emotional pressure, psychological pressure, the crushing weight of becoming a symbol. People think fame reduces loneliness. Often it multiplies it, because once the world turns you into an icon, very few people still see the human being underneath. Bruce Lee became trapped between two identities, the real man and the myth the world demanded him to maintain. The myth required perfection. The real man was exhausted, and the distance between those two realities kept growing. Chuck Norris saw glimpses of that exhaustion privately. Moments the cameras never captured. Moments where Bruce looked drained. Moments where his energy dipped. Moments where the legendary confidence briefly gave way to simple human fatigue. But Bruce always returned to work, always returned to training, always returned to the performance of invincibility. Because somewhere along the way, the world had stopped allowing him to simply be human. That is one of the cruelest things fame can do. It punishes vulnerability, especially in men celebrated for strength. And Bruce Lee represented strength to millions. Not merely physical strength, spiritual strength, mental strength, the power to transform your entire existence through discipline and belief. People needed Bruce Lee to remain untouchable because he symbolized something larger than entertainment. He symbolized mastery, and mastery comforts people. It creates the illusion that perfect control is possible. Bruce Lee shattered that illusion when he died. Suddenly, the strongest man people knew seemed fragile, mortal, breakable. That realization devastated fans across generations, but it devastated Chuck Norris differently. Because Chuck knew Bruce beyond the mythology. He knew the laughter, the philosophy discussions, the relentless curiosity, the way Bruce constantly studied movement, psychology, and human behavior. Bruce Lee was never satisfied merely being impressive. He wanted understanding, he wanted growth, he wanted transcendence. And perhaps that endless pursuit came with a hidden cost nobody fully recognized in time. Chuck Norris eventually described Bruce Lee not as a man obsessed with fame, but as a man obsessed with becoming the fullest version of himself possible. That sounds beautiful, until you realize how exhausting that pursuit can become, because perfection has no finish line. Bruce Lee was not chasing comfort, he was chasing evolution, physically, mentally, spiritually, and evolution demands sacrifice. The tragedy is that Bruce Lee may have sacrificed more than anyone realized while he was alive. Years after Bruce's death, Chuck Norris continued speaking about him with remarkable tenderness. Not envy, not competitiveness, tenderness. That detail matters because the world often tries turning legendary men into rivals. But Chuck never reduced Bruce Lee into rivalry. He treated him like family, like someone whose absence permanently altered the emotional architecture of his life. And perhaps that is why Chuck's final reflections resonated so deeply with audiences. Because age stripped away performance, there was no longer any reason for ego, no reason for exaggeration, no reason to create mythology. Only honesty remained. And the honesty was heartbreaking. Chuck Norris missed his friend deeply. Not Bruce Lee the icon, Bruce Lee the person, the friend who challenged him, inspired him, made him think differently, made him train harder, made him believe martial arts could become something philosophical rather than merely violent. That kind of friendship leaves permanent marks on a human soul, especially when it ends suddenly, especially when there is no goodbye. One of the saddest truths about unexpected death is that it freezes relationships mid-sentence. Nothing feels complete afterward. There is always something left unsaid, and Chuck Norris carried those unfinished emotions for the rest of his life. Sometimes when he spoke about Bruce Lee publicly, people expected sensational stories, secrets, mysteries, controversies. Instead, what they received was grief, quiet grief, lingering grief, the grief of a man who had lived long enough to understand how irreplaceable certain friendships truly are. And perhaps the most painful realization of all was this. Bruce Lee spent his life teaching the world how to love fearlessly, while privately carrying burdens heavy enough to destroy him. That contradiction shattered people emotionally, because it revealed the hidden reality behind so many extraordinary individuals. The strongest-looking people are often fighting invisible battles alone. Bruce Lee taught confidence, discipline, power, self-mastery, but even he could not fully escape human fragility. Chuck Norris understood that in the deepest possible way. And near the end of his life, when he reflected on Bruce Lee one final time, his words carried the weight of decades. Decades of memory, decades of admiration, decades of loss. He did not describe Bruce as invincible. He described him as unforgettable. And perhaps that is more meaningful, because invincible men are myths. Unforgettable men are real. Bruce Lee became unforgettable not because he was perfect, but because he burned with such intensity that people still feel his absence half a century later. Chuck Norris felt that absence every year of his life after 1973, and somewhere deep inside him remained the same impossible thought millions of fans secretly carried too. What if Bruce Lee had lived? What more could he have become? What wisdom would age have given him? What peace might he finally have found? No one will ever know. That uncertainty became part of the heartbreak itself, because Bruce Lee died not at the end of his story, but in the middle of becoming something even greater. And for Chuck Norris, that unfinished story never stopped hurting. There is something haunting about old men speaking honestly, especially old fighters. Because fighters spend most of their lives hiding pain. They hide it in training rooms, hide it in competition, hide it behind discipline, toughness, humor, and silence. But eventually age strips those defenses away. The body slows down, the crowds fade, the noise disappears, and what remains are memories. Memories of the people who shaped you. The people who challenged you, the people you loved. And for Chuck Norris, no memory seemed to carry more emotional gravity than Bruce Lee. Because Bruce Lee was not merely part of Chuck Norris's past, it was part of the architecture of who Chuck became. Some friendships alter your life permanently. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. You begin thinking differently because of them, training differently because of them, seeing the world differently because of them. Bruce Lee had done that to Chuck Norris. And decades after Bruce's death, long after the fight scenes became legendary, long after posters and documentaries turned Bruce into something almost mythical, Chuck Norris continued speaking about him with remarkable emotion. Not manufactured emotion, not performance, real emotion. The kind that survives 50 years, the kind that still hurts. And near the later years of his life, Chuck Norris said something about Bruce Lee that stopped people cold. He said Bruce Lee was one of the most genuine human beings he had ever known. Simple words, quiet words, but devastating when spoken by a man who had spent a lifetime around champions, celebrities, fighters, and powerful personalities. Because genuine people are rare, especially in worlds built on ego. And perhaps that was the great contradiction of Bruce Lee. The world remembers the confidence, the intensity, the impossible speed, the dragon-like presence. But the people closest to him often remembered kindness, curiosity, warmth, loyalty, a man deeply interested in human potential, a man who wanted people to grow, a man who pushed others because he pushed himself constantly. Chuck Norris described Bruce Lee not as arrogant, but as driven. There is a difference. Arrogant people seek superiority. Driven people seek transformation. Bruce Lee wanted transformation of martial arts, of cinema, of culture, of himself. And perhaps that endless desire to evolve became both his gift and his tragedy. Because transformation demands energy, relentless energy. And Bruce Lee burned through life like a man terrified of wasting a single second. The older Chuck Norris became, the more he seemed to understand the emotional cost of living that way. Because age teaches painful lessons about balance. You begin realizing that strength without rest becomes destruction. Ambition without peace becomes suffering. Purpose without stillness becomes exhaustion. Bruce Lee possessed extraordinary purpose. But stillness? Stillness may have been the one thing he never truly learned. Even his philosophy reflected movement, flow, adaptation, interception, constant evolution. Bruce Lee lived like a flame that could never stop moving, and flames that never slow down eventually consume themselves. Chuck Norris understood that with heartbreaking clarity by the end of his life. That is why his reflections about Bruce Lee felt different from ordinary celebrity tributes. He was not merely honoring a dead friend. He was warning people, warning them about the hidden cost of greatness, because the world loves extraordinary individuals, but often ignores what extraordinary individuals are doing to themselves privately. Fans celebrate the performance. Very few people ask whether the performer is surviving it emotionally. Bruce Lee spent years carrying enormous expectations. From Hollywood, from Hong Kong, from martial artists, from audiences, from himself most of all. And despite becoming globally famous, he never truly escaped pressure. In some ways, fame intensified it. Because once the world begins calling you legendary, you start feeling responsible for remaining legendary every single day. That burden is exhausting, especially for someone already pushing his body beyond normal human limits. Chuck Norris eventually realized something profoundly sad about Bruce Lee. Bruce never stopped fighting, not even off camera. He fought physically, mentally, emotionally, professionally, spiritually. Everything in Bruce Lee's life carried intensity. Even his conversations carried intensity. Even his ideas carried urgency. He spoke as if life itself were slipping away too quickly. And maybe somewhere deep inside him he sensed exactly that. That possibility haunted Chuck Norris. Because after Bruce died, ordinary memories suddenly felt loaded with meaning. Training sessions became sacred memories. Conversations became artifacts. Moments that once felt casual transformed into things impossible to replace. That is what death does to friendship. It turns ordinary moments into permanent treasures. And perhaps no realization hit Chuck Norris harder than this. Bruce Lee never truly got to see how much he mattered. Yes, he was famous. Yes, he was admired. But admiration and understanding are not the same thing. The world admired Bruce Lee while he was alive. The world understood Bruce Lee after he died. That delay is heartbreaking, because Bruce spent so much of his life fighting to prove himself. Fighting Hollywood, fighting stereotypes, fighting traditionalists, fighting executives, fighting anyone who doubted what an Asian martial artist could become globally. And then after his death, suddenly the world saw it clearly, too clearly. The genius, the innovation, the philosophy, the cultural impact, the humanity. But Bruce himself never got to witness that complete recognition. He died before the world fully caught up with him. Chuck Norris carried deep sadness about that reality, because he knew how hard Bruce had worked, how fiercely he had believed, how much pain he had endured to build something revolutionary. And when Chuck later spoke emotionally about Bruce Lee, audiences heard something they rarely hear from legendary men: vulnerability. Not polished vulnerability crafted for interviews. Authentic vulnerability. The vulnerability of someone admitting that losing Bruce Lee never stopped hurting. There is a moment in life many men eventually reach. Moment when achievement no longer feels as important as connection. When trophies matter less than memories. When reputation matters less than the people who stood beside you during the difficult years. Chuck Norris eventually reached that place, emotionally. And from that perspective, Bruce Lee no longer appeared merely as a martial arts icon. He appeared as a lost friend, a brilliant friend, a complicated friend, a driven friend, a wounded friend. And perhaps that humanization of Bruce Lee is what affected audiences most deeply. Because the world had spent decades treating Bruce like mythology. Chuck Norris quietly reminded everyone that Bruce Lee had been human, beautifully human, painfully human. A man who laughed, a man who struggled, a man who doubted himself sometimes. A man who carried invisible pressure, a man who wanted to change the world before time ran out. And somehow, impossibly, he did. That is the part that makes Bruce Lee's story almost unbearable emotionally. He achieved immortality, but not life. The world remembers him forever, but Bruce himself never got to grow old enough to understand what he became. Never got to experience the calm wisdom of age. Never got to sit quietly and watch generations imitate his movements. Never got to fully witness how deeply he inspired outsiders, fighters, dreamers, artists, and lonely young men searching for confidence. Chuck Norris witnessed that legacy grow over decades. He watched Bruce Lee evolve from man into symbol, from symbol into legend, from legend into something almost eternal. And yet beneath all of it remained grief, because immortality does not comfort the people left behind. Legends are wonderful for audiences, but friends do not miss legends. They miss voices, laughter, presence. Tiny ordinary moments no documentary can capture. Chuck Norris missed those things about Bruce Lee for the rest of his life. And when he finally spoke about him with complete emotional honesty, people around the world felt the sadness immediately, because they recognized something universal hidden inside his words. The realization that some people enter your life so powerfully that even death cannot fully remove them. Bruce Lee remained emotionally alive inside Chuck Norris, inside memories, inside stories, inside unfinished conversations carried silently across decades. And perhaps that is why Chuck's final words about Bruce Lee broke hearts everywhere. Not because they revealed shocking secrets, but because they revealed enduring love. The love between friends who respected each other deeply. The love between warriors who understood each other beyond words. The love that survives funerals, decades, aging, and silence itself. At the end of life, men often stop caring about performance. Truth becomes simpler, more direct. And Chuck Norris's truth about Bruce Lee was devastatingly simple. He never forgot him, not for one moment. Not across 50 years, not across fame, not across aging, not across grief. Bruce Lee remained one of the defining emotional presences of his life. That realization shattered audiences emotionally, because it transformed Bruce Lee's story from mythology into something deeply human. Not merely the greatest martial artist, not merely the fastest fighter, not merely the dragon, but a friend profoundly loved and profoundly missed. And maybe that is the final truth of Bruce Lee. Not the conspiracy theories, not the rumors, not the endless debates surrounding his death. Maybe the real measure of a life is simpler than all of that. Maybe it is this: who still carries your memory when the noise disappears? Who still speaks your name with emotion half a century later? Who still feels your absence as though it happened yesterday? Chuck Norris did. And in the quiet honesty of his final reflections about Bruce Lee, the world finally understood something heartbreaking. Even the strongest men cry for the friends they lose. Even legends leave scars behind. And even after 50 years, some goodbyes never truly end. Bruce Lee changed the world. But somewhere inside Chuck Norris, he remained simply Bruce. The friend he loved, the friend he lost, and the friend he never stopped missing.